Hi, I'm Greg Schaefer, and welcome to the Virtual CISO Moment. Curt Vincent joins us today. He is a cybersecurity maverick and entrepreneur, founder and leader of the 400-person Morgan Stanley cybersecurity division for 15 years, senior vice president and COO for both the Global Networking and Applications Operations Command Center at Bank of America, VP of a DevOps team at Goldman Sachs, and founder of 5 startup companies. He's also a retired U.S. Army lieutenant colonel where he played a cyber cat and mouse game with nation states as the operations officer of the Army's Global Network Operations and Security Center. Curt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on, Greg.
That whole intro just kind of choked me up. Excuse me. Happy to have you on. Would love to hear, though, if you could expand upon your past, first of all, starting with how and why you got involved with cyber and led you through an IT and technology and really where you got started in your career as well with the Army, and just bring us through from then to today.
Okay, happy to. And again, thanks for having me on. I'll try and keep it short. As I was saying, and I like to joke off camera, when you're an old guy like me, it takes forever to be able to give you your history. So let's try and do this in such a way that'll be useful to the listeners. Let's first go into the whole reason I'm into cybersecurity. Now, my background, academic background, is electrical engineering. But when I ended up back in the Army after a break, and I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point in time in terms of leadership and such, but I ended up back in the Army as an electrical engineer, and I ended up at an Army Computer Engineering Center. And something that's interesting that a lot of people don't know, and this is way back in the 80s, 10,000 years ago, is that there was no such thing as a cybersecurity or even IT security group. Everybody was responsible for their own computers' security. And I'm not talking about PCs. I'm talking about much larger minis, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So the main thing there is that if you know any history of IT, PCs were just coming into vogue, if you will, from 1982 when the IBM PC was introduced. So the Army was trying to get their hands around all of IT in general, and it had to be able to consolidate a whole lot of different operating systems and technology, and there's no time for that kind of a history lesson. The main point is that number one was to be able to consolidate on technology, and we were each asked to do our own thing within our space. My background is primarily in the Unix, Linux type of space. So from there, in growing that, and being involved in the very first time that the Army was able to use TCP/IP in a very profound way, I ended up finding myself as a communication officer attached to a special operations group that deployed to Desert Storm and ended up downrange with Desert Storm. And I have a story I love to tell about an inbound missile, which I thought was the end of my life. But the main point is that we were responsible for the security on an even deeper level because it was compartmentalized.
Where were you stationed in Desert Storm?
I started in Turkey, and then the group, we ended up moving into northern Iraq. And at the time, it was all classified. I thought I signed paperwork that said, I could talk about it in 70 years, but it's now starting to show up in.
Yeah, you can find that. I was down in the Emirates, so I was on the other side of the theater. So.
Yes, but you understand there was a pincher movement. We were coming in from two different ends.
Absolutely.
So the whole thing is to be able to understand the history of cybersecurity is twofold. One has to do with security of electronic devices in general, but then the second part is understanding the concept of entitlements, which means what are you allowed to see? Just because you're in doesn't mean you can see everything. And that's where the military taught me the concept of compartmentalization. Mm-hmm. So from there, just as a technologist, system administrator and such, ended up retiring from the Army and ended up on Wall Street because Wall Street was very big on Unix and they were very big on a unified TCP/IP environment. So I ended up on Wall Street, and through some general consulting, I ended up doing some general consulting for the top IT guy. And we had different terminologies, different names back then. And he was called the CTO, which is a little different than what CTOs are today. He was responsible for 6,000 technologists. And I had done a huge deployment for him directly.
Mm-hmm.
And he offered me a job. He said, I want to bring you in. He says, this is like 1997. He says, I think this internet thing is going to be big. And we laugh at that now. We laugh at it now. But back then, we had no idea where the internet was going to go.
Yep.
So I said, look, I know enough about security to get myself in trouble. He goes, you know more than I do. And so therefore, here's 7 people, hire until I tell you to stop. I said, okay, I'll do this until we get a group that's stabilized. Well, as I like to say, it turned into 15 years and 400 people. But we ended up growing this into something much larger with operations and engineering and incident response and all sorts of different groups to be able to do the security function that smaller companies have problems with. And we should probably talk about that. But I ended up in that role for so long to be able to develop it. And one of the things, my claims to fame, is that while on Wall Street, I used to pull all of the different cybersecurity. We called it IT security back then. Let's get it off the table. The term cybersecurity is very new. It's no more than about 5 years old. I do want to speak about that because I think it's incredibly important.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, it was called IT security. I would bring all the Wall Street and some of the banks into a room quarterly. And what I said to them was, and I pulled them all together, look, our companies compete on algorithms and customer service. If any of us gets breached, it's a stain on all of us. It's a stain on the industry. We need to work together. Everybody agreed. And we then started to share everything, just everything. We just did not keep, because everybody realized we're working for the same team, which is to protect the industry. So that's how I got into it. And in the last couple of years, as I like to say, my career is threefold. The first was the Army. Started off as a high school dropout private, and have a whole story behind how I then ended up becoming an officer and working my way up to lieutenant colonel when I retired. And then my second career was on Wall Street, technologist for 20 years. Now I'm working on my third career. Now, my third career is much more relevant to what your listeners probably want to hear. It's where is cybersecurity going? I now do private consulting. I've got a partner in Tokyo, and we try to cover the world that way. And we really only want to be able to speak primarily to the C staff and leaders, just because of the fact your average CISO is probably a geek, and will probably, I usually have a little hat with a little propeller on it. Yeah. When I talk about it, I said, this is the way the CTO and CEO see you, and we need to get away from that sort of role. But the thing I'd like to say, and this is where I'll finish up my first question, if you will, with the following, because this is really, really important. Cybersecurity is brand new. I don't care how long you've been involved in it. The term has only been around for the last 5 to 6 years. And if you ask 50 people what the definition of cybersecurity is, you'll get 50 answers. And I mean the people running the show. I've done this down recently. I was at a speech, giving a speech in Bahamas, and there were 30 super senior CISOs. And I went around the room and I went to about 5 guys asking, what's the definition? Everybody started laughing by the 5th person because they got my point. We can't agree. And as I like to say, is cybersecurity one word or two? We can't even decide that. So the point being is, and I've also taught cybersecurity at Mercy College.
And there's a little bit of like there's a clash with regards to the NIST cybersecurity framework, because yes, I believe that they use cybersecurity as one word there, but it's abbreviated CSF. So I mean, what's going on with that? So
yeah, and they start to get the term blurred with what I refer to as information security. Mm-hmm. So if I may just quickly, and then I'll let you get on to any other question, just to be able to set the framework. My belief, and the thing that I speak on very often, is what my definition of cybersecurity is. Cybersecurity are 3 disciplines primarily. The first is IT security. That's the geeky stuff. That's the firewalls. That's the endpoint security. That's all the stuff that we all love. And the average CISO doesn't want to go any farther because he or she got raised to that role by being the best geek in the room. Not the best leader, but the best geek in the room. And they deserve to have that role from that standpoint. But that's only the technical. The next area is GRC. And the reason I hesitate to name it is that most people call that governance, risk and compliance. I hate that because risk should be its own separate discipline. Governance, regulatory, and compliance. This way you're staying within the things that nobody wants to do. It's the stuff we have to do. Mm-hmm. And then overarching all of that is information security. And information security, this is where it gets interesting, is protecting the information of the company. And so therefore that includes the physical. That includes the stuff that ends up in a dumpster that can be used to be able to put a kill chain together to be able to get into your company. And it's why, by the way, with all of our average CISOs focusing on the technology, what's the biggest threat right now? It's ransomware. Why is that? Because somebody clicks on something they shouldn't.
Right.
So that's got to do with training and getting your people to stop being so vulnerable. And you can have, we used to call it in the Army, we used to call it, what you've built is an iron door on a tent. Because the iron door is all the technology and it's rock solid and you're really good at that. You got a good incident response team, but all you have to do is walk around the side with a razor and cut it open and walk right in. And with the physical security, you've got to be able to start tying that in. And I'm starting to see more of that. But what's happening is you're now seeing a person, he or she is called the chief security officer, and he or she takes the cyber guy, and New York term, guy is for guy or gal, but the cyber person and then the physical person, bring them into a room and say, if you two don't get along, I'm going to bash your heads or replace you.
Yeah,
it's a unified response, and it's something that we don't do as cyber people well at all. And I've got gobs of stories on this stuff.
Well, I think the important thing, as you pointed out, is first of all, a lot of people have different terminologies. My terminologies actually differ from yours, but that's okay, because in the end, so long as we understand what the other person is saying, we all agree on the concepts, we all agree on the scope, we all agree that physical is in there as well. It's being able to communicate that. Now, before we go on to talk about SMBs, I know you just briefly said ransomware. You said something just almost like a throwaway statement that I think I talked over. Did you say that you are teaching at Mercy College?
I did teach at Mercy College during COVID.
In Tarrytown?
Yes.
Ah, okay. Well, see, are you in that area? I thought you were in Philly.
I'm not. I put 20 years in New York City, and I just recently, in the last 2 years, moved to the Philadelphia area.
Oh, okay.
Because of taxes, to be honest.
I can relate.
New York is too much.
I grew up in White Plains and Harrison.
Oh.
So, I know Westchester. My mom, she did her undergrad at Mercy. So when you said that, I'm like, oh, that's bringing back memories. But
I do want to say that what they're teaching at colleges, I don't agree with.
That could be a whole nother podcast.
I know it is. I
mean, you just look at the news for right now. It's like there's a whole bunch of what I don't agree with what's going on there right now.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more with your disagreement.
So you mentioned ransomware just briefly, but let's talk about small and mid-sized businesses.
Yes.
They obviously form, I like to say, the backbone of business in the United States. Almost half of all employees are working for a small or mid-sized business, according to the SBA. Yes. You don't have small businesses, you don't have an economy, and yet small businesses, people don't seem to remember just how important they are, because a lot of times small businesses are used as the vector into big business breaches.
Correct.
Bank of America a few months ago. So today, what would you say are one or a couple of the most significant threats to SMB security in the cyberspace?
People. Now, let me just go on to this. When I say people, it also means organizational structure. Mm-hmm. I'd say the number's even higher. I'd go so far as to say 97% of any SMB I run into, they don't have security people. It's the responsibility of the IT person, whether it's a CIO, doesn't matter. It's one person. And so if they do have a security person, they usually report to the CIO. And that's a conflict of interest. Yes. It's like, I like to say, it's like having the VP of quality control in a factory reporting to the VP of production. It's a complete, and he or she is then just crushed whenever they try to put good things into place. So the first thing is to be able to understand that this is a threat that is not going to go away. And I run into a lot of SMBs that say the bad guys don't want our data, so we're not at risk. And I always tell them, you're right. Data is dirt cheap on the dark web these days. they're after three things. They want to use your computing resources for mining Bitcoin. They want you to be able to click on something so that they got a payday, regardless of what the malware is. And the third one that nobody thinks about is if they're able to get in, which is easy, to get into your contact manager, they then use your site to be able to attack one of your customers. And if they've got better security, they're calling you up saying, why are you attacking us? You got a brand issue now.
Right.
So big thing I'm trying to get at with SMBs is to be able to take the cyber out and take a look at it, maybe have the individual, a tiny group if you're a really small company, but still have them report outside and like to maybe the CFO or whatever, to be able to make sure there's no conflict of interest.
And I think that that's important also from a perspective, because as we were talking about beforehand, how to use your nomenclature, because you're my guest and I'm being respectful. So cyber being overarching of the three areas, IT security, GRC, the R being, and and physical security.
Yes.
Where was I going with this? He was talking about taking this away from being
no conflict.
Conflict of interest. That's right. Yeah. Well, the perception has always been that anything cyber or information security or what have you, anything in this realm has always been a technical problem, which is not the case. And whenever you have it go to a CIO, you're perpetuating that really incorrect way of thinking. So I like to say that in some organizations, I understand that you only have like a certain amount of people, particularly if it's a really small organization, you're going to have some stepping overs, and that you can manage it to an extent. But ultimately, that conflict of interest is really, really, really hard to overcome, because you're going to have folks that are going to put availability over confidentiality. They're going to put they want to get the bits and bytes flowing. So let's just say, though, let me play devil's advocate, that for whatever reason, their organizational structure, they can't move it out from underneath IT right now at this moment.
Go ahead.
What's a compensating control to reduce the risk of
absolutely
conflict of interest?
The next thing I always say is you need to bring in an outside person who can do it on a part-time basis. Now, this is a long discussion, but the difference between a virtual CISO and what I like to call a circuit CISO, meaning you're getting a time slice of that individual. Mm-hmm. And you're not just part of a huge pool. It says, call us if you need us. I got a huge problem with that with the virtual CISO concept. But to be able to get, the reason I say that is to be able to get a person who is experienced in the area, who's getting paid outside of the IT organization and can look at things and report to somebody such as the CEO, CFO, if there's a risk officer. Small companies don't usually have risk officers, but still somebody who's at the C level to be able to say, you need to fix these things. And then you start to work with the CIO and go, look, I'm not the enemy. We got to work at this together. This is the checklist. These are the things we need to be able to work off. Get this done. I'll be back next week. And then you just go away. It's much cheaper.
So what about the virtual CISO because you seem to describe a virtual CISO there, or do we have different definitions of what a virtual CISO is?
You're absolutely right. And I like to say that when you said earlier about nomenclature, I like to say before we can discuss, we have to normalize the lexicon so that we're using the same terminology. And right now, if you ask somebody what is a virtual CISO, you're going to get 1,000.
They're all over the place, and there are folks like I bang against MSPs and MSSPs that do this. They do provide it sometimes as an inside sales for some of their stuff.
Yes.
I think where you were getting at is this, like, you call up for a virtual CISO service and you don't know who you're going to get, as opposed to having the same person.
That's a good point. But no, what I'm referring to and what really gets under my saddle, if you will, that really bothers me is there are companies with virtual CISOs that oversubscribe.
That's true.
And this is just like when you buy something on Amazon and you buy it's not a good analogy, but still the whole point is that they take on too many clients because they know the clients are not going to call them. It's like gym membership at the first of the year. I hate going to the gym in January. Everybody's made the resolutions.
The resolutes,
And I can't get on any of the machines I want to get on until 14th February when the chocolate appears for Valentine's Day. but they oversubscribe, knowing fully well people are going to fall off. Same thing's true of virtual CISOs. They say that, and because the reason is, until you've had an event, you don't know you have a problem. So, and therefore they oversubscribe, and whether you call and get the same person, I've seen companies that have had 20 and 25 individual companies associated with one.
You can't do that. Usually the over under like that I like to go by is at 4, maybe 5. If you have a 7 is yours.
That's the number I like to use if there's a lot of discipline.
Okay. And I'm assuming an average of like 20 hours per week.
That's why I say with more discipline you can reduce those hours. And
well, regardless of if it's 4, 5, or 7, you get to like 20. It's kind of like, I just saw this on LinkedIn. The question had to do with ethics and is it ethical to have 2 jobs? And I'm like, well, I mean, if you're subscribing to having 2 full-time 40-hour jobs per week, you better be working 80 hours. Otherwise, I don't think it's ethical. And
I agree.
Those people that do that get 2 or 3 full-time jobs. They're time sharing, and basically what that is stealing, in my opinion.
Yes, it is stealing. And these companies that do this that I just described earlier, they usually fall apart when there's some sort of an event. Some sort of event that ripples through the entire IT field. And then everybody goes off hook.
Everybody goes calling them. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they can't manage it. And so therefore they end up blowing up. I personally believe in, it's a horrible analogy. Somebody else gave me this. I don't like using it. I got to find a better one, but it's like a timeshare. You can only have one set of guests in there at a time. And so the point being there is you can't have 50 people show up at the timeshare and say, it's my weekend. There's only so many, so the point being is there's only so many hours a day, a good virtual CISO. And that's why I call them a circuit. Just to be real clear why I came up with that term. I got the term from living and being stationed in the Southwest in Arizona. And they used to have circuit preachers or circuit judges because they didn't have enough of them. And that's what the cyber industry is experiencing. There's not enough good senior people to be able to help. And so what a circuit judge would do is he would go ride from town to town, go from Tombstone, then ride over to Bisbee, and then they'd have court on Tuesdays. And if somebody rode in from the other place and said, oh my gosh, the Johnson brothers just shot Billy Bob, then he would say, throw him in jail. I'll be there on Mondays. So the whole point being is
I'm thinking about watching Gunsmoke now. It's like, the marshal will be back, or whomever will be back on Tuesday. The judge of the territory, if you will.
Right,
so,
but that's
I kind of like the terminology circuit CISO.
Yes,
I've never heard.
I'm trying to coin it.
So every time I say that, I owe you how much?
Just a name.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. I can afford that. But, if it was like, a nickel each, that might be a little bit more difficult. But one thing I did want to touch on, and I will say this myself as a virtual CISO, and part of my story on how I got into this was that it is more about trying to help folks. And for me, it was a God calling. And I'm quite open about that. And it's a matter of really listening to what you're being called to do and then running with it. And it's always the correct answer whenever God asks you something is to say yes. If you don't mind, like just sharing a little bit about how your faith influences your walk in your career right now.
Oh, I love talking about it. Okay, because we have to bring leadership into this whole thing. Now, in my case, I had a father that thought I was very rebellious when I was a teenager, and whether I was or wasn't was not part of this. But he forced me to quit high school and join the Army on my 17th birthday. And here I show up. I ended up in the 101st Airborne, a very elite unit. The very first troop to end up in this unit, it was helicopters at the time, the very first troop to end up in this unit that was not a Vietnam vet. So therefore, if they told me to drink this, smoke that, I did whatever they told me to do because I just wanted to be a part of them. But yet, something interesting had happened to me between basic training And when I got to my first unit, and it's a long story, but I'll make a long story short. I ended up being sent from basic training to the wrong post. I got sent to Fort Eustis, which has got nothing to do with helicopters. And I tried to tell them, you're sending me in the wrong place. And they said, shut up, private, go. So I went. And that night, in the replacement depot where they house troops when they don't have any home yet, some guys came in and they were from the Navigators. And they said to me, what are you doing tonight? I said, nothing. And they said, well, why don't you come over to the chapel? We have some movies, some cookies, some Kool-Aid. And I thought, hey, that's a good way to pass the evening. So I went over and they introduced me to the concept of what Jesus did for us and salvation in general. So I accepted Christ. Now, in my own case, we don't have a lot of time to get into theology. I always believed in God, but I wasn't raised in a religious household. And I make a huge distinction between religion, which I think is man-made, and theological, which is of God, which is very different. And I wasn't raised in either of those. So it's like I don't know why, but since I was born, I believed in God. I just didn't understand how it works. So when these two guys took me and showed me how it worked, okay, so I accepted Christ. And the next morning, I go down to the equivalent of the HR at Fort Eustis, and they said, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be down at Fort Rucker, Alabama, where all the helicopters are. So I get sent down there, but with a totally different attitude, because now I'm a believer.
And there is no such thing as a coincidence.
Oh, no, I don't believe in that. In fact, Einstein said, coincidence is proof that God wishes to remain anonymous. That was Einstein. I mean, I think that's brilliant. So I end up down, this is part of the story, I'm answering your question, but I end up down in Alabama as a private in this helicopter school with a different attitude because I came to Christ. And I didn't have the negative influence of my father. So I applied myself and I came out first in the class. So I thought, wow, this is interesting. I end up at the 101st Airborne, and the first sergeant looked at my personnel folder and said, you're not going to the airfield. You're going to go to the education center and get your GED. And this guy sent me to the education center. That was my job for, I don't remember how long it took. Maybe it was 90 days. But I got the GED. I laid it at his feet, as I say. And he looked at it. He says, very good. You can go to the airfield after you go back to the education center and sign up for college classes. And Vincent, I'm watching you. And that guy stayed on my butt until I understood and got the education bug.
It's awesome.
So I owe him my life. There's a guy by the name of First Sergeant. He's a little tiny, short Puerto Rican guy who had a lot of years, First Sergeant Ortiz, who had a lot of years in the Army. So he appeared to be like David and Goliath. You know, he was like massively huge because of just his demeanor. So he got me started with education. I tried to get a degree at night, and I ended up trying to actually get an aeronautical engineering degree. And I couldn't get it done because of deployments and all. So, and go into the field. So I finally had to get out, went to college, got an engineering degree, went to ROTC, went back in the Army as a lieutenant, got a master's degree in networking, and basically learned from the Army that leadership is servitude. Very important. I was a 19-year-old sergeant. I'll never forget it, pulled under a tree by a senior NCO after I made E5 sergeant. And he said, you need to understand right now, you have to separate yourself from your guys, and leadership is servitude. And also praise in public, rebuke in private. Now, who else told us that? Christ.
Absolutely.
Who is the best leader character that we should follow? And that's Christ, because he washed the feet of everyone, to include Judas. So the whole point of that is that we need to be able to take the leadership role and be able to apply it, saying it's not about us. It's about us being able to take the talents that God has given us, and we've developed with his help, in my case, then be able to use that. And that's where we are in the cybersecurity realm. That there's not enough cybersecurity people. No one knows what the heck it means yet, even though they'll tell you they do, as it's becoming clear. And my friend, with the advent of AI and algorithms in general, it's a staggering overlay, in the same way that when we got the web, it was a staggering difference between just using ASCII characters. You know, that was staggering. This is going to be equally as staggering, and it's going to make our jobs much, much harder, and yet much, much easier, because
Yeah.
the AI can be used for good or evil. And
Yeah.
I can go on and on and on about this stuff. But does
Well,
that answer your question?
it does, and unfortunately, we're just about out of time. But very quickly, future plans?
Future plans is number one, as I said, I'm in my third stage, and I'm trying to figure out what God wants me to do with that third stage. And so, therefore, I've been doing public speaking, I've been doing consulting, and I'm just trying to be as flexible and like a free electron, if you will, to be able to see where God wants me to go so that I can do exactly what he wants me to do. I'm in the last stage of my life, let's face it. So let's get it right.
And that's pretty much my story as well too. It's like we have to shut off our internal voice, if you will, in order to listen to what and where God is leading us.
Yes.
Well, Curt, thank you so much for wonderful time. I appreciate you coming on, and I wish we had more time to chat down the rabbit hole, because there are so many more rabbit holes we could go down.
Absolutely.
But I appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your story and your faith, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Thank you for having me on, Greg.
And everybody, stay secure.